Hello, good evening, and welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. We're going to be examining what's wrong with a so-called anti-racist charity known as Hope Not Hate this evening. Now, it sounds like a worthy organisation, doesn't it? But this supposedly anti-racist body seems to have a blind spot when it comes to Zionism, which is a racist settler colonial ideology. As far as Hope Not Hate's concerned, criticising Israel is strictly off limits. They've accused people of anti-Semitism against Israeli apartheid and for standing up for the Palestinian people. This pernicious weaponization of anti-Semitism also extends to anyone daring to defend people who've been falsely accused. We saw this only last week when they smeared the socialist folk singer Joe Solo. Joe's crime was to express solidarity with me just after I'd been suspended from the Labour Party on trumped-up charges in February 2019. Then in the 2019 general election campaign, they ran a smear operation against me, which included this video that they posted online.
I'm Tess, I'm the Political Education Officer for the Jewish Labour Movement, and I'm here to talk about Chris Williamson's politics of division and the resentment that I feel he's whipped up against my community. Chris Williamson is running as an independent candidate in Derby North. He liked a tweet which said, "They own all media, power, money, lobbies." This is a clear racist depiction of Jews. Don't vote for Chris Williamson on December 12th. Whatever you do, reject his politics of division.
Now, they also issued a statement which reads as follows, if we can just put that up on the screen. Chris Williamson made Labour's anti-Semitism problem worse, and he deserves to lose his seat in Parliament. Hope Not Hate will help make that happen. It's apt that Chris Williamson's resignation letter actually contained an anti-Semitic trope. It didn't, in fact. Williamson should have had no place in the Labour Party, and Hope Not Hate welcomed his long overdue departure from the party. His pattern of behaviour warranted swift and decisive action against him that just never came. It says much about Labour's failures that Williamson turned his back on the party rather than the other way round. Now that Chris Williamson's indicated that he intends to stand as an independent candidate, Hope Not Hate will campaign to ensure that the people of Derby are fully aware of this harmful and dangerous views. We're confident that both he and his gutter politics will be rejected at the ballot box. And then the statement goes on to completely misrepresent what they describe as my track record. And in fact, what I did was to call out this shameless weaponization of anti-Semitism, to defend anti-racist activists who'd been falsely accused, and to highlight the role of the Israeli embassy in the efforts to destroy the Corbyn project. So, joining me this evening to help unpick the Hope Not Hate's backstory is the legendary anti-racist campaigner and prolific blogger Tony Greenstein, and David Miller, who's the founder of Spinwatch and a former professor of political sociology at Bristol University. Hi, David. Yeah, David, give us your thoughts about Hope Not Hate. I know you've been looking at some of their activities as well. You need to unmute yourself, David.
Hi, sorry about that. Yeah, is that better with the feedback?
Yes, we've got no feedback now. That's
so. Yeah, I mean,
working all right.
Hope Not Hate is a curious organisation. I mean, it's one of a number of organisations which are active in the anti-racist field in this country, whose purpose is to effectively discredit, divide, and demoralise the anti-racist movement. And I would put Hope Not Hate in the same category as organisations like the Community Security Trust, Searchlight, from which it came, which we'll maybe talk about more, and an organisation like Tell Mama, which was set up in part by in alliance with the Community Security Trust. And these are organisations which are very close to the British state and collaborate with the British state, especially in relation to counter-extremism, and thus get into the realms quite often of Islamophobic work and justifying counter-extremism work, justifying prevent the racist policy of the government. But they're also, all of them, quite close to the Israeli government as well, and to Zionism. Sometimes that's because of financial links, sometimes it's ideological links, usually it's a bit of both. So Hope Not Hate is one of those kinds of organizations, and it might surprise people to hear me say that because, I guess a lot of people are familiar with Tell Mama. A lot of Muslims will be familiar with the fact that they're not really an anti-racist organization. They're there to kind of, get in the way of proper anti-racist organizations from the Muslim community. But Hope Not Hate comes from this organization called Searchlight. I mean, maybe the thing to do here is to trace its history a little bit before we go on to talk about its current practice. Of course, Tony is quite right to talk about Ruth Smeeth as being a key person in Hope Not Hate, along with Nick Lowell. They're the two central figures in the organization. But let's go back. I mean, I'll try and do this quickly, but we really need to go back to an organization called the 43 Group, which was formed after the end of the Second World War by largely Jewish ex-servicemen, whose aim was to ensure that fascism could never raise its head in Britain after the defeat of the Nazis in the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as it was called in the Soviet Union. And that was an organization which was intent on street fighting, in the sense of bashing the fash, to use the term which became much more common in the 80s in this country, and they did that to some extent quite effectively. But I wanted to raise that it seems to me that the reason for telling this history is to know where they came from, but also to understand what is the contradiction at the heart of their anti-racism. What they did was they bashed the fash. They took the fascists on the streets and tried to make sure that they couldn't organize. But there was a strange mix of politics there. It was an anti-fascism which was in part allied with a nascent Zionism. So and this is perhaps the most famous member of the 43 Group, was one of the youngest members of the 43 Group, was a guy called Vidal Sassoon, who you might have heard of, the famous hairdresser, and of course he later set up a centre on anti-Semitism in the State of Israel. Now, he was a part of the 43 Group and a Zionist at the time. And of course, 2.5 years later, he ends up in the Palmach, the elite force of the Haganah, the nascent Israel Defense Forces, engaged in ethnic cleansing and ensuring that 750,000 Palestinians were pushed out of Palestine in an act of ethnic cleansing. Now, that's the contradiction at the heart of the anti-racism of this faction, which takes us all the way through to Hope Not Hate. Now, the 43 Group was wound up in 1950, but then a new group was started in 1962 called the 62 Group, and some of the people involved in the 43 Group set it up. Now, in the 62 Group, there was a leftist faction. There was a strong Communist Party of Great Britain faction. Most of the history books don't say much about there being a lot of Trotskyists there. It was CPGB people. And there was a sort of Marxist wing, as one of the people involved have put it, and there was a Zionist wing. And the Zionist wing, of course, had a contradictory element to its politics, which was that it was anti-racist when it came to fascists, except in the case of Arabs of Palestine. Okay, and now when people look back on the 62 Group, which has been immortalized in the recent TV show Ridley Road, people see this as being a unique alliance of the left, which is true, and of left-wing Zionists to counter fascists. But let's remember that these were not only left-wing Zionists. There were left-wing Zionists involved in that organization, and the most obvious ones of these are the two Labour MPs who set up a news sheet called Searchlight as part of the 62 Group, Reg Friesen and John Lester, both of whom were members of the predecessor body of the Jewish Labour movement, i.e. they were left-wing, in as much as one can say that term, left-wing Zionists. But there were also really very right-wing Zionists involved. Perhaps the most well-known of those is Gerald Bronson, who by the age of 18, before he joined the 62 Group, was already a millionaire, and he took over as the finance person in the organization. He was a right-wing Zionist. He eventually set up the Community Security Trust many years later, 3 decades later, in 1994. And the most perhaps the most hardline Zionist, we don't really know much about some of the other people, but perhaps the well-known hardline Zionist in there was a guy called Leslie Hardman, who was the chaplain to the group, and in 1970 became the vice president of Herut GB. Now, of course, as those of you who are familiar with Israel-Palestine will know, Herut was the party of Menachem Begin, the successor to the Irgun, which of course bombed the King David Hotel in 1946 and was involved in the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948, where over 100 Palestinian civilians were massacred as part of the process of ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And so these were really quite hardline revisionist Zionists who were part of this organization. So let's remember that. And all the way through this process, there have been people like that who've been involved in these organizations who have meant it's been impossible for those organizations to be properly anti-racist, i.e. to be against anti-Palestinian racism or anti-Arab racism. And that just to make the further link, which would take us to Hope Not Hate, one of the early people involved in the 62 group, and then in Searchlight, which the left-wing Zionists were involved in editing first of all, and who became the editor after it became a magazine in the 70s, a guy called Jerry Gable. Now, Jerry Gable is a really very interesting character, still around, still runs Searchlight, and later on, of course, he had a split with Nick Lowles, who went on to form Hope Not Hate formally in 2011. And Gable was a CP member, and he left the CP, according to his own account, because it was too anti-Israel. Now, I ask people when I see them if they can work out which year it was that he left. They say, 2015, 2018, so 2001, 1980. And I say, no, 1962. He left the Communist Party because it was too anti-Israel in 1962, before the territory in Gaza and the Golan, etc. So he was an ex-communist, part of the Zionist wing of this organization. And essentially what they were doing was engaged in not just in bashing the fash, but also infiltrating right-wing organizations, sending in informers, turning people inside the fascist organizations. And that was the core of their anti-fascist work. Gable was the head of intelligence for the organization for the 62 group, and then the editor of Searchlight. And here's the thing. The thing was that he eventually, as he's the head of intelligence, he becomes a spy in all senses of the word. Not just in the sense that he was actively spying and running spies, running agents inside organizations and at the time, but that he was also, by the 70s, collaborating with the special branch, with MI5. According to his own account in the famous Gable memo, which he wrote in 1977, he was collaborating also with French intelligence, with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and with another organization, which I'll come back to in a second, which I think is really stunningly interesting. So this was an organization which had become, by this stage, an asset of British intelligence. And as a result, people knew this by the late 70s. The New Statesman wrote about it. It was a big scandal at the time. As a result, nobody on the left should have had anything to do with this organization. It was clearly being used by MI5 and by the special branch. Of course, they worked closely together to spy on the left. The memo, and let's remember this, they started off infiltrating the far right. The memo was a briefing with all sorts of salacious gossip and lies about a guy called Phil Kelly, who was at that stage a radical journalist working with amongst the milieu of Duncan Campbell, Crispin Aubrey, Mark Hosenball, the American investigative journalist. I mean, Phil is still alive, and he eventually went on to become a Labour councillor in Islington and worked for Michael Meacher for many years. Now, that's who he was spying on. He was spying on a left-wing investigative journalist and smearing him as being some kind of asset of East German intelligence or the KGB or some other rubbish like that. Now, to come back to the point I made earlier, this is the thing which I think is not had enough attention. In his memo at the end, he mentions French and British intelligence and the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that's three foreign intelligence agencies. But he also mentions a guy called Geoffrey Stuart Smith, who no one will have heard of, no one will remember. I bet Tony remembers. Who was a former Tory MP. And by this stage, he ran an organization called the Foreign Affairs Research Institute, I think it's called. And in the memo, Gable says, oh yes, he's got very good CIA contacts. But when you look back at it now, it doesn't look like that organization had CIA contacts. In fact, it was almost entirely funded by the Bureau of State Security of the apartheid regime of South Africa. And so, wow. I mean, stunningly, and people have, I think many people haven't noticed this, stunningly, not just they're working with Israelis with MI5, but with the apartheid regime to spy on the left. And of course, they were also looking at Palestinian organizations and the Palestinian solidarity movement as a key part. And all the way through the process of Searchlight, it's been a consistent hostility towards what they've called, and Tony's blog says this very well, Arab terrorists and the Iranians and all that kind of stuff. Very consistent with the kind of Zionist perspective. And they in fact sacked one of their editors when he made the mistake of writing a story which was critical of Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. So that's the ideological pedigree. This is an organization, Searchlight, which worked with the state, was a state asset. I believe still is a state asset. And that's the milieu in which Nick Lowe's worked when he took over as editor of Searchlight. He was, according to Larry O'Hara, I have no reason to believe this isn't true, he was recruited from the Union of Jewish Students, which of course is formerly a Zionist organization. And it shouldn't be any surprise then, therefore, that Ruth Smeeth, a long-time Zionist activist, has been central to Hope Not Hate. Smeeth and Lowell, the two most central actors. And let me finish up and let Tony come back in here a minute. I mean, I think that's an indication, really, of the orientation that they have towards the state, both in terms of the state of Israel and the Zionism, which suffuses their conception of anti-racism, and on the other hand, their connection with state counter-terror objectives. That is, their concern with radical Islam, with extremism in the country, etc. So they've collaborated with a number of organizations, for example, Inspire, which have collaborated with it, which are themselves current, or were themselves at that stage a couple of years ago, current assets of British intelligence, in the sense that they worked with RICU, the Research, Information and Communications Unit of the Home Office, which of course, as many people will know, is part of the Office for Security and Counterterrorism, which people don't know widely enough is itself formally a British intelligence agency. So I mean, there we are. That's all the way through this process. Zionism on the one hand, and Islamophobia and government intelligence strategies and perspectives.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, from what you're saying there, I've sort of had this suspicion about Hope Not Hate for a while now, but they're kind of like a fifth columnists operating inside the Labour movement. And they seem to have, with a lot of people, even now, a decent reputation, and they're supported, I believe, by trade unions, and certainly a lot of Labour Party members, for example, have been very supportive of them. Indeed, before they started attacking me, before I was re-elected to Parliament, I remember them offering up speakers and being at meetings where they were participating. This is locally in my own constituency, and indeed in adjoining constituencies. And I kind of worked alongside, because I wasn't aware at all, I've got to say, and I won't be unique, that many people will have been in the same boat as me. And obviously these scales have fallen from my eyes. I think they're falling from increasing numbers of people, but they still are a respected and deemed a legitimate anti-racist organization. I mean, do you think that's a fair description to refer to them as a fifth columnist, a bunch of fifth columnists operating inside the Labour movement, David? Or am I being unfair to Hope Not Hate? I mean, how would you describe them?
Well, I mean, I think that you're right to say that they have a lot of support in the Labour movement. Searchlight, as a result of the number of scandals that happened in relation to it, became increasingly seen as an object of suspicion on the left. Not nearly enough, but it was an object of suspicion. So that, for example, it was part of Unite Against Fascism. It worked closely with, I mean, extraordinary, really, when you think back at it. They worked closely with Red Action, with Anti-Fascist Action, with the Anti-Nazi League, with Rock Against Racism. They were part of Unite Against Fascism. They resigned from Unite Against Fascism because there were too many whispers, they said, of people in Unite Against Fascism referring to them as Zionists and being skeptical about their pro-Israel politics. And I remember at the time, the Jewish Socialist Group, an organization which, looking back at it, really ought to have known better, complaining about them leaving and asking them, effectively begging them to come back, and saying, we need to work closely with if we don't work closely with people who have a different position with us on Israel, meaning Zionists, then that will be a free pass or an open goal. I'm paraphrasing, for right-wing Zionists. Now, of course, the story I've been telling reveals that right-wing Zionists, very right-wing Zionists, have been involved in this movement and milieu from the very beginning. Right back to Vidal Sassoon. The best year of his life, he said, was when he was involved in ethnic cleansing in Palestine. I think has been a mistake on the left to think, well, actually, we might have a difference in Israel, but we can collaborate on anti-racist politics apart from that. But of course you can't, because there's one thing you can't touch, and that is Israel-Palestine. And that then it has consequences. I mean, if I mention again the question of South Africa, I mean, this is very, very familiar to me from, if you look at similar organizations in the US to the Community Security Trust, which we haven't talked about, but which is a parallel sort of organization coming out of the 62 group. And there's an organization in the US called the Anti-Defamation League, which, it was very pro-Israel from the very beginning of its existence, right back to before the creation of the State of Israel. So it was pro-Zionist then. It had people involved in it who became involved in the Haganah, just like Vidal Sassoon did. And in, I think it's the 90s, people in California will jump on me if I'm wrong, but there was a huge scandal because they were actually engaged in collaborating with the police in California and sending intelligence to the apartheid regime. So, and that that's an indication really of where that kind of anti-racism takes you to the very opposite. If you're blank and blind on Palestine, in the end, what practically happened was you end up collaborating with other racist regimes as well as with the Israelis. And so I think that's fair. It's fair to say that this is a really problematic thing, and it's fair to say people don't understand this. People understand it a little bit more about the Community Security Trust than they do about Hope Not Hate, but Hope Not Hate has managed to extract itself from all the controversy that there was around Searchlight. I mean, really lots of different controversies there, and smearing of people as fascists. I mean, do you know what Searchlight do? Their MO was to say, oh, well, we're against fascists and we're against the contemporary fascists of today. And if you look at the contemporary fascists of today, you'll find that they are having contacts with actual fascists. And so we should see these new organizations as being fascist. And they're talking about the PLO having contacts with fascists. They're talking about anarchist groups having contacts with fascists. They talk about elements of Trotskyist groups having contacts with fascists. And that's their MO. They smear any of their opponents in the movement, or even people they're working with, as being fascist adjacent or fascist light, or having contacts with fascists.
And yet Zionists and
the state agenda.
Yeah, I mean, and yet, as we know, the kind of Zionists work very happily with the likes of Tommy Robinson, which is interesting, So, but anyway, let me see if we can bring Tony back in now, and hopefully we've sorted out that technical problem with the feedback. With the likes of Tommy Robinson. No, we haven't actually. I'm still getting feedback. Gaz, are you getting feedback, Gaz, here when we bring Tony in?
Yeah, same here. I'm not sure what's going on with him.
That's a pity, really. We might just. I don't know if there's anything more that Tony can do, or whether you can do offline. We'll stick with David if you're okay with that, David. I wonder if you could maybe say a little bit more about Gerald Ronson and the Guinness fraud. And I think you've talked a bit about. I think you mentioned the CST, but then you kind of elaborated a bit and referred to them as the Community Security Trust. People may have been wondering what that is, but I wonder maybe you could say a little bit more about that, perhaps.
Yeah, so I've told this kind of potted history, and let's go back to the 62 group. So as I mentioned, Ronson was the finance head in the 62 group, but he would be, when that started, he'd be 23 or thereabouts. Apparently, he was by the age of 18 a millionaire. He'd left school at 14, straight into his dad's business empire. He says, if you Google him, he says in various places that he was worth over $1 billion in the 80s, lost a lot of it in the crash. And he also, lost a bit when he was fined several £1 million and had to go to jail for a year, served 6 months for his part in the Guinness fraud, which they appealed, of course, all the way up to the highest court in the land, and sadly lost. He was involved, found guilty of criminal offences, fraud, or false accounting, etc. And this is the man who, when he was in prison and inverted commas disgraced, was visited by key Israeli politicians. Benjamin Netanyahu visited him when he was in prison. He was named as one of Netanyahu's millionaires in a famous story in the Israeli press, where a handwritten note was found with a list of names. He was one of the names on that. You can look that up. If you Google Netanyahu's millionaires, you'll find his name there. And he was involved with the 62 group, and eventually they decided. I mean, he was famous. He brags about this being famously was known for being good with his fists, and at the time, and they then decided that they had to become a bit more respectable, and they set up this Jewish activities organization. Jacob was its acronym. Leslie Hardman, the revisionist Zionist Hoot vice president, was involved in Jacob, and they were critical of the Board of Deputies and were involved in trying to be more. What's the word he uses? Devious. So they didn't so much do so much violence, he says, but they were more devious in this new organization and in the successor organizations, including something which was known as the Group Relations Educational Trust, which became eventually in 1994 the Community Security Trust. Now that's another organization. There's the Community Security Trust milieu, and there's the Searchlight Hope Not Hate milieu, which came out of this 43 group, 62 group succession of organizations. The CST is set up as an organization which says that it's there to counteract and combat anti-Semitism and to protect British Jews from attack. And it has its own kind of private army of security guards who attend communal events and guard synagogues and Jewish schools. The CST now gets something like 14 million a year from the British government to help with that activity, including money which came from was signed off by when he was a minister, Michael Gove, who was at the same time also, and this wasn't widely known, was covert. He was a member of the advisory board of the CST, and I know this because it was me who discovered a document online which named all of the members of the advisory board, which hadn't previously been public, and they of course hadn't disclosed that when, or at least it wasn't seen as an issue when they decided to give all this money to the CST. So CST is there to protect British Jews against anti-Semitism, but of course, in the way of Zionist politics, they're not really either able or willing to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Or let me put this a different way: they deliberately foster a blurring between the two of them, and the CST has been central to that in the sense of operationalizing a blurring between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. But not just that; it's also been centrally involved in an Israeli government forum, the Coordination Forum for Countering Anti-Semitism, which was run by Mossad, in coming up with the idea that anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism. So it's been directly involved in that process of reimagining anti-Semitism as being something which would, some years later, catch Jeremy Corbyn and lots of us. So they've been strongly involved with the Israeli state, indeed with Mossad, and this has been widely known, I guess, for the last 10 years. I mean, the way I first got into touch, became involved with the CST, if you like, was in a case in 2011, I think it was, where the Palestinian politician Sheikh Raed Salah was coming to talk in Britain, including in Parliament. I think Jeremy Corbyn was involved in inviting him or something. And the Theresa May, the Home Secretary, decided to exclude him, but they decided too late because he'd already arrived on a previous flight and they hadn't known. So they then they put him under house arrest, and he went through this process. And it turned out in the trial, which I was called as an expert witness by the defence, that the evidence on which he was excluded was provided by the CST. And there were various things about the evidence which were dubious, including the translation of a poem in which the word oppressors had been changed to the word Jews. Oh, big surprise there. And also in the material that the CST were using to promote the idea that Salah was a problem and should be excluded, including a number of different writers on Israeli politics who are, transparent racists. So that was when I came across the CST, and as a result, partly of that, the exposure of some of their evidence being dodgy, they lost the case, and Salah won the case. And as a result, since then, I've had a number of run-ins with the CST, including, of course, most famously, as far as I'm concerned, at least, they were the first ones to complain about me at the University of Bristol, which led to me eventually being sacked there just the other month. So the CST is part of that milieu and part of the poisoning of anti-racist politics in this country. I mentioned Tell Mama earlier, and Tell Mama is a similar organization. CST is there to monitor anti-Semitism. Of course, it blushed together. Anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. Tell Mama was set up with the aid of the CST. One of the key directors of the CST, which of course they try and keep secret because they've got this dispensation from Companies House not to name their trustees, but there are ways of finding out who they are. Anyhow, this guy from the CST was on the board of Tell Mama, helped to set it up, and Tell Mama, of course, is an organisation which is dedicated to countering Islamophobia, but its definition of Islamophobia is, of course, quite different to a sensible one in the sense that it excludes the state from Islamophobia. So it excludes counterterrorism powers and civil liberties infringements, all of which have a direct negative impact, disproportionate impact on Muslims, but none of which are included in Tell Mama's data collection. They want instead to focus on the same people that Searchlight or Hope Not Hate or the CST focus, which is the far right, except for the far right who are on their side. Just like the ADL. So there's that kind of tension in there. So Tell Mama is another organisation which has poisoned the well of British anti-racist politics, and we ought to be much more clear about that than we have been.
Well, we need to, and hopefully we've made a bit of a start this evening in actually trying to sort of clarify some of that stuff. But it is interesting, obviously, Hope Not Hate's role in actually smearing socialists and undermining the Corbyn project. And I think you touched on this, but I wonder, just before we try one more time with Tony, if you could say a little bit about Hope Not Hate's involvement, if any, with the security services today, do you think, David?
Oh, we're not having Tony.
Yes, I'm going to come to Tony in a sec, but I just wonder if you might want to say something about Hope Not Hate's links, if any, with the security services today.
Well, I mean, let's talk more about Ruth Smeeth. I mean, no doubt Tony will mention more about this than I will. But Ruth Smeeth, of course, known to most people, I guess, who've come across her as a Labour MP, a centrist Labour MP, who was anti-Corbyn, etc. But she starts her career. Let's not go right back, but as a lobbyist for the New Health Network, which was a Blairite, neoliberal discussion group, favourable essentially to the privatisation of the NHS. Then went to work for Sodexo as a lobbyist, again, in the same milieu. Then she, skipping a job, she went to then work for. Is there a company more hated than Nestle? Maybe there's one or two. She worked for a year as a lobbyist for Nestle, and before that, she started her formal jobs for Israel Lobby Group. She worked for BICOM for a little while, which is the Britain Israel Communications and Research Centre, the key PR agency for Israel in this country, funded by another one of those Netanyahu millionaires, Zlodovich and others. And then after Nestle, she went to work for the CST, the organisation which we've just been mentioning. And she has 2 years there, and then she starts to work for, she says on her LinkedIn for Hope Not Hate, but she was working for Searchlight at the time because it was called Searchlight at the time. I hadn't changed its name. And she becomes a director of Searchlight, which then changes its name to Hope Not Hate, and then she's a director of the other company, becomes the deputy director, I think, in 2015. Now, Ruth Smith, of course, or Ruth Strictly Protect Smith, as we must call her, is another indication of the connections that these organizations have with states and the extent to which they are state assets. In the time when she was working at the CST, there's a WikiLeaks cable. If you Google Ruth Smith Strictly Protect, you'll find it, which records a conversation between someone from the State Department and Ruth Smith, who is giving her advice on what Gordon Brown is going to do next. And they say this is not known, etc., etc. But they refer to her as a Strictly Protect source, which is a confidential source. So, and she's never, of course, adequately described, explained, or rebutted this. But that means that she is, or was at that time, an asset of the U.S. state. I mean, there's no other way of putting this. And if you want to define this clearly, look up the word agent on MI5's website, and you'll see that what they refer to there is covert human information sources. Informers are known in MI5 as agents of MI5. People who work for MI5 on a basis, they're called officers of MI5. So these people, Jerry Gable, Ruth Smith, others, are assets or agents of states. We shouldn't be thinking that. I mean, I think some people on the left think, oh, well, Gable would just have these dodgy contacts. But let's not look at it from the point of view of Jerry Gable or Ruth Smith. Let's look at it from the people who are in charge here. That is the states. The US state, British, Israeli state, and indeed, as I mentioned, the apartheid South Africa state. So I mean, there is every reason to suppose, given the milieu from which they came, that Hope Not Hate is and remains an asset of British intelligence, and of course will have connections with the Israeli state. Yeah,
and not surprising, therefore, that they were, implicated in trying to undermine Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him, and supporters of him, and people like yourself and others. I mean, Tony, let's. Oh, sorry, go on, David. Just forget. Yeah.
I mean, let's make this slightly more concrete than I was kind of speaking slightly conjecturally there, but we don't need to speak so conjecturally. I mean, I think no doubt other people will know more about this than I do, but let's look at some of the people involved with Hope Not Hate. Just take two examples of people who connect Hope Not Hate to the British state and to the Israeli state. First of all, there's a guy on there called Kari Asim, who is also on a number of government committees. He's on the board for imams set up by the government. He's also on the anti-Muslim hatred working group of the government. And these are counter-extremism bodies. He's also involved with an organization called Imams Online, which, of course, just like the organization Inspire I mentioned before, has worked with British intelligence via RICU, the Research Information Communications Unit of the Home Office. So Kari Asim is, let's be very clear about this, an asset of British intelligence. I mean, he looks like a kind of, perfectly respectable imam, but he's an asset of British intelligence. And that links, Hope Not Hate, without saying anything about Ruth Smith or Nick Lowes, to that milieu. And then the second person, who's no longer there, is who was on the board of Hope Not Hate for a while, is a person who helped set up British Muslims for Secular Democracy, but also was on the list of employees of the European Foundation for Democracy. Now, that's a Brussels-based think tank, which is a subsidiary of the Washington, D.C. based Foundation for Defense of Democracies. So that's an organization which is effectively the Likud front, which in the Al Jazeera program, the Lobby USA, the former Director General of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, Sima Vaknian Gil, refers to FDD as being an asset of the Israeli government. In the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, of course, is the ministry in charge of anti-BDS and anti-Palestine solidarity activities. Now that puts this person who was on the board of Hope Not Hate as being a person who's involved in an organization which is itself directly an asset of the Israeli government.
Yeah.
I've talked a lot about assets and agents tonight, but these things are real relationships, and we ought to be clear that they're relationships which can have an impact on people's activities.
Well, I think that's very important, because I think a lot of people will be absolutely aghast that this is the background to Hope Not Hate. Tony, let's hope we can not have the technical problems now. I mean, David's very, very succinctly, I think, set out there the kind of history and what led up to where we are today, and some of the background to Hope Not Hate at the moment. Now, as I was saying when I tried to introduce you at the beginning, Tony, you've written a blog this week, and you took Hope Not Hate to task in that. I wondered whether you could maybe summarise perhaps some of your concerns that you included in that blog, and any other comments you might have in relation to some of the points that David has already mentioned.
Yeah, I hope the problems have now dissipated.
It seems to be sorted now, mate.
Yeah. I mean, David mentioned that there's a direct link between Hope Not Hate and the 43 group. I'm not sure that is the case. So the 43 group was a genuine group which arose after the war, when the union movement, also Mosley's group, began gaining strength again in the East End and holding public meetings, etc. And the ex-servicemen who formed the nucleus of the 43 group consisted of communists as well as Zionists and people who were unaffiliated. And then, as David said, they disbanded in 1950 and then resurrected, or a new group, the 62 group, came into being in 1962. I don't think there were, one can say there was a direct link, or indeed any link. I think the 62 group is more problematic. Gable was clearly a central figure in that. And Gable, who became editor of Searchlight, incidentally, the first editor of Searchlight before him was the late Maurice Ludmer, who was president of Birmingham Trades Council and was clearly a figure of the labour movement. He also resigned from the Communist Party, but not because of its position on Israel, but because it didn't take the fight against racism and fascism seriously. So I think he was qualitatively different from Gable. And his position was basically the issue of Palestine or Israel shouldn't intrude into anti-fascist work. And I think most of us agreed at that time. I mean, Palestine was not the issue of apartheid that is today. Let us remember that most people were ignorant at that time. There was no Palestine solidarity movement and so on. But the situation under Jerry Gable, I think, developed quite differently. And Gable, who clearly had very close links with all sorts of intelligence agencies, British, American, Israeli, and David's mentioned French, was engaged in essence in the process of trading information. He got information from the special branch and fascist, and in return he gave information on the left and anarchist groups. And I've detailed in my blog, because I was an executive member of Anti-Fascist Action in the late 80s. They set about destabling anti-fascist action by making completely bogus allegations, in particular against a group called Class War. They were basically a front for the National Front. And AFA suspended Class War on the basis that, well, if it was in Searchlight, then it was true, because Searchlight had a good reputation then. And we set up an inquiry. But lo and behold, when it came to providing any evidence to back up their assertions, it was conspicuous by its absence. And I put on my blog links to various documents, which, including the inquiry report, which details this. There's absolutely, I don't think, any doubt. Where groups like Hope Not Hate come in, well, Hope Not Hate split off from Searchlight in about 2011, but there was no principle break. It wasn't that Nick Lowell's and Jerry Gable disagreed with each other. It was a question of money, in essence, that Nick Lowell's considered he could make it on his own, and he didn't need, if you like, Jerry Gable hanging around his neck. And it was probably a wise decision from their point of view, because Searchlight today is really a shadow of what it was. Gable himself is very old, and Searchlight is, I think, hardly functioning at all, to be quite honest. Rolls and Hope Not Hate are a different kettle of fish altogether. Incidentally, Hope Not Hate, when it started, was clear that it didn't have a position on Israel, Palestine. I can remember Rolls saying he didn't want to vocalize on Palestine, but clearly that position changed. I suspect with the emergence of Ruth Smead in about 2015, David's gone into Ruth Smead. She was one of the main figures in the Jewish Labour movement who led the attack on Jeremy Corbyn. And I think people will remember her storming out of the Chakrabarti press conference when Mark Wadsworth called her to task for her dealings with Telegraph journalists. And I don't need to go over that. Quite false.
She was calling for the whip to be withdrawn from me 2 months after I was re-elected in 2017, Tony, as well. So yeah, she's certainly got form for.
Yeah, she is an agent of multiple groups in a sense, and that was the task of the Jewish Labour movement. It was refounded in 2015. There's a very good article by Asa Winstanley on Electronic Intifada about how this Zionist group in the Labour Party, which was all but dead, it had done nothing, it was completely quiescent, was reactivated after Corbyn's election. And the reason is because they had unique access to the Labour Party by virtue of their affiliation as a socialist society. They could move resolutions, they could affiliate to local parties, and so on and so forth. But if you like, Hope Not Hate, I think have overdone it. I mean, David mentioned about how the Jewish Socialist group begged Searchlight not to leave United against fascism. Well, today, I mean, David Rosenberg of the Jewish Socialist group has left Hope Not Hate, and there's quite a bitter critic of them now because, I mean, for whatever you can say about the JSG's politics, I mean, they were supportive of Jeremy Corbyn, and Hope Not Hate were one of the leading flag bearers, if you like, of the attack on Corbyn and the and running on the Labour anti-Semitism nonsense. So it's a very clearly different story. But what they are, in essence, is bourgeois anti-fascists. So they take the position that, yes, they don't like fascism of the right, but they also don't like the left's opposition to Israel and Zionism. So they steer a middle course, and they do it in alliance with the state itself, which is, if you like, the root cause of racist and fascist movements in this country, and it causes them certain, if you like, schizophrenia. But I think Hope Not Hate overplayed their hand when they attacked Joe Solo because they weren't expecting the backlash that they got. You know, I mean, there are allegations that he needs training or on anti-Semitism, which, you know, it's like Chinese re-education or what happened under Stalin, that you need to be educated about anti-Semitism. Well, it's quite simple. CST.
Well, it's not education, is it, Tony, about anti-Semitism? It's basically forcing people or indoctrinating people to assume or conflate Zionism. I just want to, Tony, if I may, because we've only got 10 minutes
on the CST.
Yes, of course. But I just want to bring Sean in, so just to kind of get reaction, so you can respond to any comments that people who've been watching might have.
I just wanted to mention briefly on the Community Security Trust, which has an especially close relationship with Mossad, which is Israel's MI6. And there's a very interesting article. It's in a book by Jewish Voices for Peace in America, and it's an article by Tony Lerman, who is an expert in anti-Semitism. He was in fact sacked from the Institute of Jewish, or forced to resign from the Institute of Jewish Policy Research because he diverged very considerably. Now, he mentioned in this article, and it's really worth going, it's in this booklet on anti-Semitism, that in the 1990s, he was approached by Mossad, the Mossad representative in London, and said that Mossad were taking over the collation of anti-Semitism statistics internationally, and that they wanted his operation, because he'd been doing much the same, to basically fold. They didn't want him doing it any longer. They were taking it on board. Now, you might ask yourself, say in this country, why would MI6 want to collate statistics on racist incidents. I mean, there'd be no reason whatsoever. It wouldn't be their job. Why would Mossad be interested in it? Clearly, it's because anti-Semitism was seen as a key point of Israel's foreign policy objectives and its propaganda abroad. And that's what CST does. If you look at their reports, they produce an incidents report each year. You'll see that the way they manipulate it, so that anti-Semitism is always seen to be increasing. And one of the ways they do that is by the mixing social media anti-Semitism, which I think is unquantifiable, with genuine incidents of anti-Semitism. I assume that the rest are genuine incidents, because social media anti-Semitism, I mean, one person could put out 1 million tweets, but no one's ever died from a tweet. So it's a completely subjective exercise, which is in tune with what the Israeli state wants, which is to put over the image and the idea that anti-Semitism is continually increasing, and therefore Jews in the diaspora, really what they should do is pack up their bags and go to Israel. I mean, that's the end product of it, as well as, of course, weaponizing anti-Semitism against radicals and anti-Israel groups in whichever country they happen to operate. So it's clear it's a very political organization, and Hope Not Hate has really embraced all of that. Hope Not Hate, are a pernicious organization, and I think one of our jobs is to get them out of the labour movement. I think that's one of the tasks for socialists, to say, we don't trust you any longer. Yes, you've done good work in, say, opposing Tommy Robinson, but what you can't come to terms with is the fact that this Tommy Robinson is the most avid supporter of the state of Israel. He was welcomed as a hero on the last pro-Israel demonstration in May outside the Israeli embassy. Answer us why you think Tommy Robinson and neo-Nazis in general love Israel today. What is it about Israel that people on the far right who are anti-Semitic find so acceptable?
Yes, indeed. And of course, and that never really came out, certainly not in the mainstream media, or indeed any of the leading figures, even under Jeremy's period, really, in the Labour Party. It never really kind of highlighted that. And they were allowed to sow a myth, and that was used to destroy all our hopes that we might be able to get a modest socialist program and anti-imperialist foreign policy as a key platforms for a future Labour government. Of course, that's all been completely destroyed now. But look, we only got 5 minutes left. Let me just quickly bring in Sean, see if she's got any observations and if there's any comments from the people who've been watching. Sean, any thoughts, any comments from people?
Hi, everybody. No, there's not that many. I think we've got a lot of people watching tonight, and I think people are just absolutely fascinated by this story. I think most people on the left have heard of Hope Not Hate, and they just associate it with an anti-racism group. So it's quite shocking to people to hear the whole background of Hope Not Hate, where they've come from, those links with the CST, with BICOM, with MI5 in the past, and Searchlight, and Gerald Ronson, the fraudster, and it's a mind-boggling story. It's a brilliant story, and we do need to educate people on this. I've just had a couple of questions in the last couple of minutes. Let me stick my specs on because I can't see. Demon Child 1977 says politicians across the spectrum defined the LSE protest as violent and anti-Semitic. The prevailing MSM orthodoxy forbids any criticism of Israel. Will this ever change?
What do you think, David? You're muted, Dave. That's it.
Well, I think yes, it will change. The moment where organizations change from being demons to being legitimate participants in politics is the moment when they're about to win. So I well remember the moment where a backlit bust of Jerry Adams standing in a BBC studio featured on a panorama just as the peace process was about to be sealed. Just like remember the time when Tory students used to wear their Hang Nelson Mandela t-shirts, and then of course Nelson Mandela became this kind of a sainted creature. And that's what will happen in relation to Israel-Palestine. We already see the signs that there's a collapse coming. Let me put that in two ways. One, in Palestine, we see that with the failed and botched Israeli attack on Gaza in May, with the evacuation of Lydda by settlers. First time that's ever happened. The overwhelming of the Iron Dome. We see an axis of resistance across the Levant, which has, I think, the best chance now it's ever had of pushing seriously against the Israelis. And I think that also has its counterpart in this country, which is that, in this country and in the US, popular opinion has been moving against the Israelis for a long time. Popular opinion in Jewish communities has been moving against the Israelis for a long time. And as a result, they've panicked, and they've got to spend a lot of money and a lot of effort in creating a whole raft of new pro-Israel organizations. If you look back at the history of the creation of new pro-Israel organizations from 2009 onwards, especially since 2014, there are literally hundreds of new pro-Israel organizations in this country alone, all of them created with impetus and input from Zionist groups in Israel, or indeed from the Israeli government. And that's because they know that they're losing a public opinion battle. And at some point, that's going to collapse. And when it collapses, it will come quick. So will it ever change? Yes, it will. I'm hoping it's going to be sooner rather than later, but we can't.
Well, we'll do all we can to speed it along. Listen, we've only got a minute left. Sean, do you want to quickly get that last question in and ask Tony if he can do a 30-second response?
One from Kevin Rathbone. He says, I've read about the signing Israeli state secret helpers. Can we refer to these?
Any thoughts on that, Tony? Are you familiar with that or not?
Yes, the cyanin. I'm not sure one should concentrate on that, because we know who the main actors are in the battle to put over the Israeli case. But I think the main thing, and I emphasize what David said, Israel and its propagandists have to attack us as anti-Semites, because what they do, both in Israel and in the West Bank, is indefensible. You can't justify, in its own terms, arresting children in the early hours of the morning, blindfolding them, beating them, not allowing them access to lawyers, forcing them to sign confessions in a language they don't understand. It's far better to attack your critics as anti-Semites. You attack the messenger, and you don't deal with the message. And that's what. And that's
why we need to be brave and stand together, shoulder to shoulder, and call it out wherever we see it. Something that never happened, unfortunately, during Jeremy's time as leader. Not by the leadership anyway, but he did. But we need to fight back, and we're beginning to do that, and we've made a decent start this evening. We're out of time now. We've gone about 30 seconds over. Thanks very much indeed to our guests, Tony Greenstein and David Miller. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you next week at the same time, same place, 7 o'clock. Good night.